Greetings everyone and welcome back to the channel. It is Zakes here and thank you for joining us. Today we will be talking about something that I think is pretty topical, right? Recently we had the Lieutenant General of KwaZulu-Natal province give a pretty, for lack of a better term, detailed expose, right, of the inner dealings of what a lot of us suspected happens within the South African police service and the corruption really between the executive and said police service, right, even at the highest of echelons. So today really we want to be talking about security, the policing cluster of our society, of course from a libertarian perspective, and what we want it to look like, what the problems are really, and what solutions, right, we should present to have a functional police force. Because, you know, even though there may be some among you who are anarchists, right, who do not believe in the state or the existence thereof, right, if you are a monarchist or even an anarchist, I think you would agree that, you know, the protection of life, liberty and property ought to be one of the only things really the state should be concerned about should it exist. And if you really have no problem with the existence of a state, then you would know that one of the foremost responsibilities of the state really that justifies its existence and supports it and enhances it is the protection of life, liberty and property. And the sector really responsible for that we have designated as human beings, I know, as a police force that is funded by the state. And in South Africa, our police force is problematic, at least according to, you know, Lieutenant General Mthembu down there in KZN. So, you know, really, I think we should begin from what we as libertarians want, right? At the Free Market Foundation, I personally, right, was involved in working on a project called the Section 12 project, by the way. If you know, none of you know about that, please go on section12.org.za. The link will be in the description and you can go and check out the work that we have been doing, really talking about something like criminal justice reform and a general overhaul of how we look at particularly, you know, the protection of life in the South African context. We don't think that the South African government takes that seriously given the amount of violent crimes that we have, right? Given the amount of really murders and threats to property that we have as South Africans. We have normalized this thing, right? Using, you know, the Lieutenant General's expose just a couple of days ago as an example, right? He was talking about having a political killings unit that was disbanded really by a national police commissioner himself, right? Like things like that. Really, I think we should start there. What is problematic, right? Why is it that the power to disband units that are objectively trying to identify harm in a particular area in society contingent on the whim of one singular commissioner, one singular minister, or even the president themselves, right? The whole principle of the rule of law is that not even the people who govern us are allowed to break the law. But given that our law is set up in such a way that the power of the police are centralized under one body, then situations like this will happen. And that brings me really to the main point that I want to make about this, right? Using the point of, you know, the disbandment of the political killings unit that shows our high violent crime rates in South Africa and how like we just moved on from all the people. Just as early as I think a couple of weeks ago, there was in the East Rand an auditor who was gunned down. And I think we all know why that auditor, who was working for the state, who was probably investigating some, you know, malfeasance that was happening there. We know why they were gunned down. We know why Babita Deocran was gunned down. We know why the myriad, you know, why the engineer, Mr. Swart, was gunned down in Vereeniging, right? We all know why these people are killed and murdered. It's due to the inherent grift that has cemented itself in our state, right? And as you know, as an aside, my solution to that is just have the states reduce the scope and size so that these people don't even have an avenue to be corrupt and kill people over things for, right? But that's a topic for another day. By using that example of a violent society and the centralization of power, whereby you would have a national police minister pretty much disband a unit that is there to stop harm that is happening in society, it brings us into one of the solutions that we have. You know, in the Section 12 initiative, we were focusing on, you know, violent crimes. And I think thinking of this institutionally will help us, right? Beyond the personalities of Lieutenant General Mthembu and the Deputy Police Commissioner, or the national minister of police, right? Beyond those personalities, because, you know, let us say best case scenario for every South African, those implicated in the minister and the deputy police commissioner, as an example, are, you know, jailed, prosecuted, imprisoned, or at the worst, just, fired from their posts. The thing is, the structure that made such malfeasance and corruption possible will still be there, right? The ability of an officer or an official, really, in the executive to take control of police investigation, of criminal investigations, to the extent of, telling a particular investigation officer to hand over dockets and things like that. These are things that are structural, right? Irrespective of the personalities that are currently involved in them, there is an allowance through legislation that gives someone who is in a position of power at like deputy police commissioner level or ministerial level the power to do that. It gives them, the wherewithal to do that. And I think we should focus on those powers, on those legislative provisions, so that instead of hoping for, and as we should, of hoping for ethical leaders in the future, we hope we do find them, but instead of hoping for angels to come down, we should really just build institutions that are as immune as possible to corruption through malfeasance, right? And one of these, in our Section 12 initiative, we present solutions, and I think the best solution, right, the best case for the decentralization of the police force and really the localization as much as is possible of said police force is this recent scandal, right? As part of the solutions, we have decentralization. South Africa already is a federal country. I know, given the large amount of centralization we have in the country, this is very hard to believe, right? But we are already a federal country, federal jurisdiction. Our constitution gives credence to this through apportioning the competencies or the responsibilities of different spheres of the state, from the national to the provincial, right down to the municipal level, right? Meaning that the structure, the framework of devolving powers is already there, right? Instead of having the police force everywhere, from KZN to Gauteng to the Western Cape, reporting to a singular deputy national commissioner, and that being their, superior officer, which they are, for lack of a better term. Let us try and localize police force as much as is possible. This is a case for it, right? Without there being a superior officer who's telling Lieutenant General Mkhwana, as an example, to, hand over dockets for certain criminal investigations that his team is a part of. Without a superior officer, that doesn't happen. If the KZN Police Department is only accountable to the people of KZN through their elected representatives in the legislature or through any other mechanism that I think really we should start exploring, right, beyond parliamentary, accountability that we actually have to exercise by voting. But, if the police force there were accountable to the people who they are serving directly in KZN instead of a national commissioner, in most cases that does not even live in the province that they are trying to interfere in, that does not happen. And that accountability to your local constituents only happens when you devolve powers away from the national sphere. This has to be something that we have to seriously consider, especially when it comes to policing, right? The research all across the world is pretty much clear that the more local the police are, the better they are, right? Think if we can get to a point whereby, a particular municipality's police department is accountable to the people of that particular municipality, right? To the point of that the police chief or the station chief in that particular municipality for that force is the highest decision-making body concerning criminal investigations, instead of it being a national commissioner who's hundreds of kilometers away from the local community that is being affected. Currently in the Western Cape, they are I saw a story recently on News 24 of certain citizens asking for the deployment of the army in their communities, given the large amounts of violence that they are facing, right? Imagine if the Western Cape and the people of the Western Cape, the people they vote for, were the ones responsible of apportioning resources, determining police strategy, right down to the highest decision maker being located in the Western Cape, or even further than that, the highest decision maker concerning policing activities being located within the communities that are most affected by said, activities that are pretty harmful to society, right? Being located in Mitchell's Plain and all of those in all of those areas, I think that will be better. That will eliminate the prospects of, political interference when it comes to criminal investigation, and also create accountability, which I think is something that we want, right? Like, it is much more easier to hold someone who is closer to you accountable than it is to hold an office that is usually nameless and faceless until there's a scandal, like right now, right? I doubt a lot of us knew who even was the Deputy Police Commissioner up until he was named by Lieutenant General Mukwana in his press conference. So really, from a libertarian perspective, right, of course, we have other solutions too concerning the criminal justice system in its entirety in South Africa, but I wanted to really hone in on the devolution aspect and the broader point of the structural nature of our problems rather than the personal nature of them. Of course, the personalities involved, I think, are unethical prima facie, really. We'll have to see if there is an investigation and evidence there is there, but at a prima facie level, the entire thing that was exposed by the Lieutenant General in KZN seems to be unethical. And I'm saying beyond those personalities who are unethical, we have to actually seriously look at the institutional reforms, at the structural reforms that we must take, and that involves a change in legislation, and change, really, it could even go as far in, like, at least how we interpret the Constitution. That may be too long term, so maybe a constitutional amendment, but I don't think that we'll need that to devolve policing powers. We just need political will and a strong, legislative framework that will enable local communities all across South Africa to hold their police much more accountable, right? To avoid instances where the political elites can influence who and who is not being investigated contingent on their proximity to them. But yeah, as a libertarian, really, that is my view. I wanted to really focus on, firstly, the devolution of policing powers, which is only just one solution among many in the Section 12 website. Please do go and check those out, right? They involve things like developing more prisons, and being better in defining criminal acts, so that we focus more on violent acts of criminality instead of non-violent ones, and things that I think are structurally aligned and structurally focused, instead of focusing on whether who the police commissioner is or whether they're good or bad. Of course, these are conversations we should have, but for long-term change, I think we should focus on the structures that enable political interference. And one of the best ways to get rid of political interference is through devolution, decentralization, and make it that much more harder for these people to exert their, undue influence over things that the state ought to be doing. So really, those are my thoughts, as I said, from a libertarian perspective. Please do tell me what you think. This is something that I'm pretty passionate about, just like every really libertarian topic. I really go crazy for liberty, for lack of a better term. I love the idea of it. I love that people get to have property, liberty during the course of their lives. So you also, please do tell me what you think. Right down below. Engagement helps us a great deal. Give the video a like if you haven't given it a like. Share it to whomever you think you may be interested. Subscribe to the channel if you unsubscribe to watch some of the other content that we have here. And as always, remember, stay free.